Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we try to cut through the noise and get you truly informed. So right now, the nation's capital, D.C., it's buzzing, not just with the usual politics, but with this really fierce debate over crime and federal power.
Yeah, it's definitely heating up.
Exactly. I mean, just last week, we saw President Trump declare an emergency, deploying National Guard troops. He painted this vivid picture, right? A city beset by crime.
But then you had the pushback.
Right away, D.C. city leaders fired back, claiming crime rates are actually at a 30-year low. So it's this striking clash of narratives.
It really is. And that's where folks like Charles Lehman from the conservative Manhattan Institute come in. He's arguing that maybe neither side is, telling the complete story.
Okay, so Lehman sees issues with both sides. How so?
Well, yeah. If you dive into his analysis, Lehman points out some significant oddities in the data that the D.C. Police Department, the MPD, puts out publicly.
Oddities? Like what?
Their official reports often suggest a much bigger drop in violent crime than the data they actually send over to the FBI. It's interesting.
So the numbers don't quite match up.
Not entirely. But what's crucial to understand, though, is that even with these discrepancies, key things like homicides and car thefts, they actually show pretty consistent trends, whichever data source you look at.
Okay, so some core trends are stable despite the fuzziness. What about the federal deployment itself, the arrests?
Right. So the administration, they quickly boasted about 52 arrests in just one night. And later, the total was 465 arrests and 68 guns seized since the whole federal intervention kicked off.
Those sound like significant numbers.
They do. But as Lehman wisely points out, these are just raw numbers. They always need more context to really get a grip on their impact on, long-term crime trends.
Gotcha. Context is key.
Absolutely. And this whole situation unfolding in D.C., it's more than just local crime stats. It's really a perfect lens, I think, to see how conservative principles are actively redefining how we think about justice and public safety right now, and sometimes in surprising ways that challenge older ideas.
So the big question then is the American justice system about to undergo its most significant conservative transformation in decades? And more importantly, what does that actually mean for you?
That's what we need to unpack.
Okay. Today, we're taking that deep dive into conservative approaches to crime, justice, and individual rights. We'll explore the powerful ideas driving policies, from federal boots on the ground in cities right down to how the Constitution itself is being interpreted.
Let's get into it.
All right, let's first really look at this rationale behind federal intervention, using D.C. as our main example. President Trump's emergency declaration, the troops. It clearly reflects a belief in strong, decisive federal action against what's seen as a crime surge. But this isn't just a one-off thing in D.C., is it?
No, not at all. This kind of move, this decisive federal intervention, it aligns perfectly with a much broader conservative blueprint, something called Project 2025.
Project 2025. I've heard that mentioned. What is it exactly?
Yeah, it's more than just a policy paper. It's really a comprehensive plan. And it advocates for, quote, drastically reshaping the Justice Department's mission.
Reshaping how?
Well, the core idea is to prioritize what they call political agendas that line up with federal goals, and crucially, to expand federal control over local law enforcement, especially in places they deem have rule of law deficiencies.
Expand federal control over local police. Okay, what would that actually look like, on the ground? Can you give us some concrete examples from Project 2025?
Sure. Well, it could mean federal prosecutors stepping in to charge local district attorneys for having what they term decline to prosecute policies, especially for lower-level offenses.
So overriding local DAs?
Potentially, yes. Or you might see a big increase in federal law enforcement presence for things like firearms and drug cases, even if local officials prefer, say, community-based solutions. And another really big point in Project 2025 is eliminating all existing DOJ consent decrees.
Consent decrees. Remind us what those are.
Right. So consent decrees are basically court-enforced agreements. They happen between the Justice Department and local police departments, often after finding patterns of misconduct. They mandate specific reforms.
Ah, okay. So they're tools for police reform.
Exactly. They've been pretty crucial for reforming police misconduct for decades now. Getting rid of them would significantly cut back on that kind of federal oversight.
And what's the justification from that conservative viewpoint for such a strong centralized approach, especially bringing in the National Guard like in D.C.?
Well, from that perspective, deploying the Guard, even if they don't have, full arrest powers serves a few purposes. One, it could be a very visible deterrent, right? Sending a message.
A show of force, essentially.
Kind of. And maybe more strategically, it can free up constrained MPD officers. Let them focus on high crime areas. And you have to remember, D.C. police staffing is substantially below historical highs.
So it's partly about resource allocation, too.
That's part of the argument. If you have fewer local cops, federal help fills the gap. And there's data backing this focus. Research consistently shows crime is a highly concentrated phenomenon.
Concentrated?
Yeah. Like in 2023, more than half of homicides in D.C. were in just 2 wards. And get this, 10 blocks were home to 14% of homicides.
Wow, that's specific.
Right. So the conservative view emphasizes pushing resources directly into those major crime areas. The goal is to restore law and order and counter what they see as leniency in local policies. It's about reasserting control through strong, targeted enforcement.
That discussion on federal intervention really highlights the reach of government power, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And, speaking of the state's ultimate power, let's shift gears. Let's talk about another deeply held conservative principle that's also seeing some really fascinating internal debate. Capital punishment.
The death penalty, yeah, always a heavy topic.
It is. And its place within conservative thought seems to be, well, evolving, which is interesting.
It's truly fascinating, actually. There's this significant and maybe surprising shift happening. Traditionally, of course, many conservatives, thinkers like Charles Stimson at the Heritage Foundation, they've seen the death penalty as an essential tool.
Right, for deterrence and punishment.
Exactly, for deterring and punishing heinous crimes, ensuring justice and restoring order. They talk about general deterrence, sending that message to society, specific deterrence, stopping that specific person, and retribution.
And they often point to the Constitution, right?
Yeah, they do. Proponents point to the 5th and 14th Amendments, which mention the deprivation of life being permissible with due process. It's seen as constitutionally sound.
And we definitely saw that traditional stance emphasized during the Trump administration's first term.
Oh, absolutely. Remember President Trump's executive order, January 20th, 2025. It directed the Attorney General to pursue the death penalty for all crimes of a severity demanding its use.
Right. He specifically mentioned certain crimes.
Yeah, like murder of a law enforcement officer or crimes by an alien illegally present. And his first term, well, it saw more federal executions than in the previous 56 years combined. That's a pretty powerful statement of that traditional approach.
Yeah, it certainly is.
But, and this is where it gets really interesting, maybe counterintuitive for some.
Yeah.
There's a significant and growing movement within conservative circles now pushing for abolition.
Wait, hold on. Conservatives arguing against capital punishment? That feels like a major shift for some parts of the movement. What are their arguments?
It's a really compelling development, and their arguments are actually rooted in core conservative principles.
Like what?
Okay, so take fiscal responsibility. Organizations like the R Street Institute argue the death penalty is antithetical to fiscal conservatism. Why? Because studies consistently show the cost of pursuing and carrying out a death sentence it far outweighs the price of life without parole. It's incredibly expensive.
Okay, so the cost argument. That makes sense from a fiscal conservative angle.
Right. Then you have conservatives who oppose it based on their pro-life stance. They extend that respect for the intrinsic value of life to everyone. And this gets amplified by the very real risk of executing innocent people.
The irreversibility.
Exactly. The idea that a government system could make that kind of fatal, irreversible mistake that deeply troubles them, it ties into that core conservative skepticism of centralized state power.
That makes a lot of sense. Skepticism of state power is fundamental.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it leads some to question a system that critics point out is woefully error-prone with those irreversible consequences. And the statistic that really sticks with you here is 1 exoneration for every 9 executions.
1 in 9. Wow.
It's a powerful, sobering figure. And even institutions like the Heritage Foundation, a bastion of conservative thought, they acknowledge there are valid arguments regarding the historical use of the death penalty against minorities.
So concerns about bias are also part of the conservative critique now.
Yes. Critics like Arthur Reiser and Mark Hayden state it has an extensive history of overt bias. This whole internal conservative debate, it's having real-world effects. It's leading to bipartisan efforts to repeal or reform capital punishment in states like Wyoming, Montana, Kentucky, Ohio, all over.
So this isn't just theoretical debate.
Not at all. It shows how traditional conservative values are being re-examined in some really surprising ways.
That is a truly remarkable internal shift. Okay, let's move from the state's power over life and death to another principle often at the heart of conservative identity, the Second Amendment. Always a hot topic.
Always. And for many conservatives, the Second Amendment is just unequivocal. It protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms, period, separate from any militia service.
Seen as a defense against
Primarily a defense against potential government tyranny, and also, crucially, for self-preservation. And when the amendment mentions well-regulated, they argue that historically meant well-armed or well-working, not heavily restricted by laws.
So an individual right not really tied to military service in their view. How do they connect this to public safety, the crime deterrence argument?
Right. Proponents argue that an armed populace can deter crime. The thinking is criminals might think twice if they suspect potential victims could be armed.
Okay.
And they emphasize that firearms reduce the lethality gap. That's the idea that a gun can level the playing field, say, between an elderly woman and a physically stronger assailant.
So it empowers potential victims.
That's the argument. And from this perspective, stricter gun laws mainly just disarm law-abiding citizens.
Okay.
They believe such laws do not deter criminals who'll find weapons regardless.
That's a very clear argument for self-defense and deterrence. But, critics always point to the sheer number of gun deaths, mass shootings. How does the conservative 2A crowd, the Second Amendment advocates, how do they address those very real concerns?
It's a critical point, absolutely. And many in the 2A crowd tend to advocate for addressing the root causes, things like mental health and poverty, as the primary factors driving gun crime, not focusing so much on gun control laws themselves.
So focus on the why behind the violence, not the how.
Sort of, yeah. The argument is if you tackle the underlying societal issues, violence, despair, you'll naturally see less gun crime. Restricting access for law-abiding folks, they believe, doesn't solve the fundamental problem. But, to be fair and impartial, we have to acknowledge the alternative perspectives. Critics strongly argue that the more armed a populace is, the more weapons will be used for violence. They point to daily shootings, mass shootings.
And suicides, too. Right?
Exactly. That's a huge part of it. Critics highlight that 54% of gun deaths are suicides. And they cite data suggesting a strong correlation between higher gun ownership and higher rates of violent crime. So you have these really starkly contrasting views on the path to safety.
Definitely contrasting. Okay, we've covered a lot today. We've seen this range of conservative thought, traditional stances, but also these really evolving views on core principles like the death penalty. Is there a consistent conservative approach emerging on criminal justice reform overall, or is it more like internal debates shaping different paths forward?
That's a really crucial question, and it gets to the heart of the nuance, maybe even the divergence within conservative thinking right now, because you see both.
Okay, explain that.
Well, on one hand, you absolutely have the Right on Crime movement. This is an initiative led by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and it really exemplifies a reform-minded conservative approach.
Reform-minded? How so?
They champion things like cost-effective solutions. They focus on reducing recidivism.
Yeah.
That's, stopping people from reoffending after release, restoring victims, and promoting community and significantly faith-based programs for nonviolent offenders.
So less focus purely on punishment for nonviolent crime.
Exactly. And their efforts, they've been associated with lower crime rates, lower recidivism rates, and frankly, substantial savings for taxpayers. Moving away from super expensive incarceration for nonviolent crimes, it's pragmatic, rooted in efficiency, rehabilitation. It aligns well with fiscal conservatism.
Okay, so that sounds, well, pretty different from the philosophy we heard about earlier with Project 2025.
It is, yeah, it's a stark contrast. Project 2025's blueprint, as its critics describe it anyway, pushes for draconian policies that research has shown do not make communities safer.
Draconian how? Remind us.
Where Right on Crime emphasizes reform and efficiency, Project 2025 really prioritizes stringent, federally driven enforcement. It talks about politicizing the Justice Department, removing oversight via those consent decrees we discussed, and significantly expanding federal control over local law enforcement.
So two very different paths forward being advocated within conservatism.
Absolutely. You have one focused on smart, cost-effective reforms, rehabilitation, and another focused on a more centralized, traditionally tough-on-crime approach with much broader federal reach. And these differing visions, they directly impact the future of public safety, your individual liberties, and ultimately how justice gets administered in your community and across the whole country.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've unpacked how conservative thought is deeply, deeply engaged in these ongoing debates over crime, justice, the role of government, all the way from the streets of D.C. to interpreting the Constitution.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that traditional tough-on-crime stance. It often leads to calls for federal intervention, expanding capital punishment, like we see outlined pretty clearly in Project 2025.
But not just that.
Right. But we've also discovered this really powerful and growing movement within conservatism. Think right on crime. It's advocating for fiscal responsibility, limited government, even, surprisingly, abolition of the death penalty. And all of that is rooted in deeply conservative principles, too.
So these aren't simple single-issue debates at all. They reflect really complex, sometimes conflicting interpretations of what safety means, what liberty means, what justice means, and all these ideas are vying for influence over the future direction of the nation.
It's definitely a dynamic, evolving landscape.
Yeah.
Different conservative philosophies are contending, really, to define the best path forward for our justice system. And they're challenging assumptions, both from within the movement and from outside it.
So as you consider these varying conservative approaches to crime and justice that we've discussed today, maybe ask yourself this. How much government power are we as a society willing to centralize in the name of public safety? And what balance truly preserves both order and individual liberty for all Americans? Something to think about.